Okay, so it's just after 4 o'clock. I just want to welcome you all here today for our learning and teaching webinar in February involving Professor Joe Finch, who's going to talk about having courageous conversations with students struggling in practice placements. So a webinar that will be useful across professions and vocational degrees. So I would like to welcome you to Professor Joe Finch and the webinar today.
Okay, so thank you very much. For some reason, I can't see my video, but anyway, it's probably just as well you don't see me. So welcome everyone, thanks for coming. And you'll see there my lovely book. So this is Shameless Self-Promotion. So I noticed today it was on sale for £9.59, bargain, what a price. Okay, so what I'm going to do today, the areas I'm going to cover, just kind of brief introductions. I wanted to just talk very quickly about my starting point in this kind of area of thinking about placements and thinking about what can go wrong and some key incidents. And I just want to talk generally about what I've called the strange world of practice education across professions. So whilst I may talking largely about social work, I think many of the issues I'm going to talk about are kind of features of practice education across professions. So whilst my research has looked at largely what happens in social work placement, certainly the literature I'll be referring to has come from a whole range of professions. So I think whilst we all have our own peculiarities in our own professions, these issues about practice learning are not just within nursing or within social work, they're there. And if people are in the audience from outside social work, I'd love to talk to you, because I think these issues are there and potentially serious in lots of professions. Sorry, my computer's frozen. I'm just going to talk about concerns. So I think this will have resonance amongst disciplines other than social work, but certainly there's been long-standing concerns, and we hear about this failure to fail, which I am going to contend. And then I want to look at, so what is very clear from the literature is that failing a student on placement is not a nice experience. I mean, that's a statement of the obvious, but it's not nice for university tutors, it's not nice for practice educators or mentors, and it's certainly not very nice for students. And rather than blaming people for not failing or blaming students for not being, high enough caliber, I have researched or thought about with colleagues as well about what might be at play here. So what could be the explanations for why some of these issues occur. I'm going to then talk about courageous conversations, which is a notion I came across which really spoke to me, and I thought it was kind of a better way of saying it than saying a difficult conversation. I'm going to talk about the process in brief. So, what to do when a student is struggling on placement. And I'm aware that there may be social work students or students from other professions in the audience. So this isn't just about students failing. I'm going to acknowledge here that placements can let students down spectacularly, as can practice educators and mentors. So I know the word failing is quite emotive, but don't worry, social work students. And just, if we have time, a kind of learning check, and then we'll have a discussion. I do tend to go on a lot, but I will try and finish at 5. We might go a little bit over. So I've been a social work educator for 20 years now. I started off as a practice educator in 1998, which meant that I undertook a qualification, and it enabled me to assess students in placement, social work students who were on their placements with me. So that was work on the whole I really enjoyed. And I suppose I've always had an interest in practice learning. And I suppose my focus has been what happens when things don't go to plan. And I'm going to tell you a bit more about that later, why the focus is there. I am still writing about practice learning, but I also write about other things. So prevent and radicalisation and social work, my colleague David from Scotland. And I guess in my life before social work education, I was a children and family social worker, mainly working in a number of London boroughs and charities. I also trained as a play therapist. And as I said, I became a qualified practice educator in 98, I think it was, a long time ago. And I've said there that I'm a secret Viking. So if I do workshops, I ask people to tell me their secrets. So this is me as a secret Viking. So can I just say, I don't go to reenactments. This is just something I did once. You can see I don't take myself very seriously. So in terms then of my starting point many years ago, there's me there looking much younger, you know, I suppose, as I worked in social care before I came into social work, and I suspect that all of us from whatever professions, whether we're students, you know, that we may think, we might not want to vocalize, but who on earth let that professional through? Who let that nurse, you know, qualify? How on earth did that social worker ever pass the course? And I think that's, you know, we all come across professionals, some professionals, not many, from, you know, and we do wonder why they entered that profession and how on earth they passed the course, which is quite, you know, I think we need to be honest about that. And there were kind of key incidents that led me to be really interested in practice learning. I mean, not only because I was a practice educator, I enjoyed it, but I could see the challenges. The assessment processes were very odd, but I had these early experiences, particularly when I became the new social work lecturer. So I'd moved from practice, frontline practice, where I knew the language and the jargon, to working in a college of higher education. I didn't really know what my role was, so I struggled to articulate what was my role as a social work lecturer, which would be different from a social work practitioner, and particularly what was my role when I went out and visited students on placement. And one of the key instances was what I call the foyer man. So he worked with a student, and he failed the student, and really there wasn't sufficient grounds. And I'd noticed he was highly critical of the student. And in particular, he kept talking about her pronunciation of foyer. Now, she had a Nigerian accent. It was very clear she was saying foyer, but he kind of went on, and that really made me think about kind of racism in practice education. And I mean, there's other people that talk about that better than I do. I also was a practice mentor at one point. So I was assessing new practice educators, so the people that assess students on placement. And the trouble is in social work that we change the words practice mentor, practice assessor. But I was mentoring the new practice educator, and I went to do observations of him doing supervision with the student. And it turned out that he hadn't been following any of the processes. He hadn't been offering the student supervision. There wasn't really any of the support. And when I raised this issue with him, he reacted quite badly and made a number of allegations in relation to me. And also in this role, I talk about the practice educator who bent over backwards. She was assessing her student who, in my view, was not getting it. So he, you know, was struggling with what I call the very basics of office etiquette. So not being able to use a diary, you know, not contacting service users. And the social worker, I think, got in a rescuing role with him and passed him. And I was very concerned about that because I didn't think he had met the requirements. But in my role as a practice mentor, I couldn't really intervene. And I called the team that lost its head. So in my early days as a social work lecturer, what I saw was a team who really was struggling to deal with what happens when students struggle on placement, or when students engage in practices that are potentially quite damaged. So all these things led to my interest and thinking about it, and being a new lecturer and not really knowing what I was doing. And I had the opportunity in 2003 to explore this via a professional doctorate in social work, which, you know, really kind of honed me into the kind of the literature at the time, what was happening, and this weird, strange world of practice education. So as I said, whatever, you know, discipline you're from, teaching, nursing, early years, allied health professionals. Practice education, so the process of a student being on a placement and being assessed with kind of whatever model, it's a very strange, difficult thing. So I always argue that it's a very difficult task to assess someone. You know, is their practice in this particular field, is it good enough? Does it meet the requirements? Do you have what do these requirements mean in practice? You know, that some of the practice education books in social work present this in a very simple way. We just get evidence. Have they got evidence of this? Have they got evidence of that? Fine. But I think it's much more complex than that. And I'm kind of, as I progress through the doctorate and in my later research, I've became more interested in the emotional processes which are there in all teaching and learning relationships. And I suppose, given how common and taken for granted practice education is in so many professions, really there's not a great deal of research on this. And those of us that are interested in practice education across professions stick together quite closely, and we all know each other. And often, I mean, in social work, not now in England, but there was, a number of competency approaches to the task of assessing professional practice. And that has been criticised, that complex practice is broken down into discrete tasks. Like I can remember, communicate and engage. I have communicated and engaged, therefore tick. So there was a concern about tick box. I'm interested if people hear from other professions how they kind of manage competency approaches. As I said, in social work in England at this current time, we have a capability model, and I think that's much better actually. And I think it's helpful in terms of really assessing students and being able to evidence whether they have met the requirements by the end of the placement. And I think there's also something which doesn't quite fit, so round pegs and square holes, about the move, how professional education is now firmly within universities. I'm not criticising that. I think that's on the whole a good thing. But in some ways, professional regulations and norms don't always neatly fit into university systems. So, for example, in social work, there are different practices in different universities. So in some universities, the placement is seen like any other module. There's no difference. It's a module, and therefore a student has the right to have 2 attempts. So this would, at an assessment, so this would be the same for a placement, unless there are very, very serious fitness to practice issues. I mean, at my university, UEL, and we argued strongly that it should not be treated like any other module, that it was quite different, and that actually if a student failed their placement, there needed to be a process about thinking about what happened, what the student saw their role as, what happened. So sometimes the placements are not very good. And then a decision is made about whether a student has a repeat placement. Linked to that, I think, is the kind of challenge for university tutors about how they manage being a registered professional and a university lecturer. So as a university lecturer, obviously, I uphold students' rights in terms of, following assessment procedures and ensuring that they're not set up to fail. I guess as a registered professional, so I'm registered with the Social Work England, I have responsibilities outside of the university to service users, patients, people who use services. And sometimes I've found that conflictual. The kind of placement day, so how many, is very much an artificial construct. So I remember I trained in a different era, and our placement days were 50 and 80. Before that, they were shorter. So, and nursing placements, I know, tend to be shorter, but, the question is, what is the best number of days? Well, that depends. So the point about that is that all students have different starting points. And of course, we would accept that. But is the endpoint the same if students have 80 days to show that they're capable of doing this role? So I think that's what also makes it kind of peculiar and strange. And of course, I suspect, though I think there is a PhD in this, is really to think about the kind of gap between doing enough to meet the placement requirements and is that enough to work as a newly qualified worker. So certainly for all professionals, that first year of practice is a massive steep learning curve. It's bigger than anything they've ever done. And there are various ways of supporting people. But, you know, I think that's an area to focus on. Since social work students would do an assessed and supported year of employment. And again, there's an area of research there about, are people progressing through that? Are people being given the benefit of the doubt? Is it screening out people who not therefore, you know, cannot manage the demands of practice, which, you know, as we all know, are getting, you know, the demand on services is significant. And I think the reason why I'm interested in, you know, the failing students or the failing placements is that I think all these complexities, these issues, the emotional side of teaching and learning, I think when when things are not going well, let's leave it as kind of loose as that, then I think all these complexities really come out to the fore. You know, the tension, if you like, between practice and the academy, you know, the role of theory and what it looks like in practice. And I think they can, you know, when something goes wrong, this is when they all kind of come crashing into our consciousness. But I'm going to talk a bit more about that. So I'm interested to know about other professions, but in terms of social work, there's been long-standing, if I go back to literature, the 80s, long-standing concerns about the quantity of placements and the quality of placements and what placements are good enough. And we've had endless reviews into social work, education, probably best not get me started on that. And, you know, people have criticised kind of non-local authority placements. And I don't know what it's like in Suffolk, but in London, you know, placements are hard to come by and there is a shortage. So another kind of issue was a concern that the rarity of social work placement failure, this concern that there's a failure to fail in practice learning settings, and it's very vociferous in nursing. There was a concern that students are being passed inappropriately, and what that means for the profession. So in terms of the rarity, then these are some of the examples of it being raised, and these are some of these UK writers, some are Australian, some are American. And checking it, through the different qualification routes, so we've had lots of different types of qualification, actually the failure rates remain the same. It's 2 to 3%. So some people would claim that's a very low rate, but I have to say the failure rate is neither here nor there, because what you're comparing it to, different professions have different approach to failure. I mean, you could argue that we do really good gatekeeping before students come on, but this is the failure rate. So I don't, you know, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Really, it doesn't mean much on its own. And so, as I said, it's very dominant in nursing and allied health. Sorry, my partner just sneezed and frightened me. You know, it's very vociferous, and I have a bit of an issue with this failure to fail, because what I think it does is it blames the practice educator. It just says you're not doing your gatekeeping job, it's your fault. This is why we've got rubbish nurses, because you're not doing your job properly. So it's a very blaming, individualistic discourse, and it has crept into social work. And you'll notice my name there, but I'd put a question mark. But actually, because I've started to look, well, I've been looking at this. So the evidence for that view that there is failure to fail in practice learning settings, it's hard to justify. So what we have are a series of kind of small scale qualitative studies, and I'm not criticizing them because I've done it myself, where really people are talking about, you know, how hard it is and the barriers that can get in the way. And some people have reported that with the benefit of hindsight, they probably should have failed a student. But you'll notice I'm using very tentative language. So it could be, it may be, it's seen that. All I can say is that when I go and speak to practice educators all around the country, there will be people in that room that have failed students. So I think it probably is happening. We just don't really know the extent of it. But if you hear failure to fail, then be very suspicious, because I don't think it really helps us, because what's more important is to understand the dynamics, what's going on, you know, why is it hard and what can happen when it's hard. And as I said, there's so many reviews into social work education and social work. But the view is, you know, are students being passed inappropriately? And again, the evidence suggests we don't really know. It could be, it might be. And this is the, you know, as I said, this is, you know, how do we measure, assess professional practice? Because it's not a set of discrete tasks. It's all those soft skills that are quite hard to assess. And, you know, what is good enough? We don't know what is good enough social work. No one knows. We think we know what it is, and what's good enough might be not good enough in one agency. It might not be good enough for one individual. And we know that social work agencies are also not always that good themselves. And that's not a criticism. It's just, you know, part of the kind of structures. So there is this concern, and it's been said without any kind of, I think, critical commentary, really. It's been used, for instance, to advocate for fast track social work schemes when the evidence isn't there. But perhaps I won't go into that. But anyway, when I started my doctorate, I have finished, by the way, I looked at the literature. So what made it difficult? So what does the literature say about why it's hard? So this is, you know, why is it hard to fail? Not why are they not failing students? So it's what makes it hard or difficult. And again, this is across professions, it's international literature. So one view is that practice educators, mentors, field instructors, you know, whatever you call that person who's assessing in the workplace, that they're not using the competency model of assessment appropriately, or the model of assessment. So they're struggling to make sense of this model and how it works in the messy world of practice. Another key kind of idea or notion is that placement procedures are not followed. So, and of course, if you don't follow procedures, then the student will have and should have a right to appeal. So it's almost like placement issues are not addressed, they're addressed too late, and then you don't have enough time to deal with it. And I'll talk about that a bit later on. Another one is that practice educators and mentors are not supported by their own agencies or people within it and or the university. So practice educators can often feel very isolated, stressed, feel like they've got the burden of this student. And I know from experience that, you know, it's not always valued in agencies when social workers or take on students. So often it's voluntary. They don't often get paid, although the agency might get paid. They might get a little bit of pay. And it's often felt like it's a bit of a hobby. So a long time ago, you would have got some workload relief for having a student. That's all but gone now. So it's almost like, well, you wanted a student, you sort the problem out. Another theme to emerge in the literature was that of role strain or confusion. And this is almost like the kind of the fundamental issue of social work, the care versus control function. So for some practice educators, they found the role of the practice educator. So you've got the nurturer, the supporter, the enabler of learning on one hand, and then you've got the assessor on the other. And for some, they struggled to kind of bring those two roles together. And so they were confused and struggled with it. And so I'd imagine students would be as well. The fear of litigation. So this is a more of a North American concern, but students, I know, the rare occasion students will threaten litigation, but it's much like the fear of a crime. So it's more a threat. But nonetheless, practice educators found it very, very stressful. And I guess given that social work, given that students are spending so much money on their own education, one wonders whether kind of rates of litigation will go up. Another view put forward is the rule of optimism. So child protection social workers will know this theory. It's quite old. I mean, it's a bit contentious, but there's an idea that when we're assessing someone, be they a family or a student, that we would tend to overestimate the strengths and the positives and underestimate the things that perhaps are not so positive. And then you can get kind of skewed reports. And I like, this is from counselling psychology, but this kind of notion that you just hope that the thing goes away on its own, that it would just sort itself out. And the danger of that, of course, is that you never address the issues and then it's too late. So due process hasn't been followed. I was also interested in, then became interested in the kind of the feelings, the emotions. And again, this is international, multidisciplinary. So Bogo et al. So Marion Bogo did an awful lot of research in practice learning. Unfortunately, she died very recently. But she's probably the person who's done the most in terms of practice education. But she says that failing students caused quite a significant value conflict, particularly for social workers. But I've seen this in other research from other professions, that you have a belief as a social worker people can change. You accept students have different starting points. You accept that you've only got 80, 60 or however many days to demonstrate you're capable for this job, and that this kind of artificial construct was just very difficult. It's very difficult to say, no, that's it. You haven't demonstrated what you need to in this time period. And Gizara and Forrester's American counselling psychology study. And I use this quote because it describes that kind of physical feeling, that gut wrenching, and that it just didn't feel good on any level. Basnet and Sheffield said, that's an English study, that actually the experience of failing student was a negative one. Now, I might challenge that and say, it's not very nice. It really isn't very nice. But actually, for some of the people I spoke to or speak to, there's learning in that. So, you learn what you could do differently next time, perhaps. Schaub and Dalrymple, that's a UK study, and they initially set out to look at what support practice educators needed, but it ended up being all about what happens when a student fails. So they, practice educators were really stressed, isolated, didn't feel supported at all, felt very on their own with a student that sometimes they perceived as threatening and could damage their careers. And that's me there. So Finch found the experience caused a range, there's a missing A, of challenging emotions. So there you are, one doctorate in one line. And I didn't really set out to find this, but I mean, it was inevitable, I did really. But these were some of the feelings, the intense feelings that emerged. I mean, really strong, difficult, powerful feelings, dread, anxiety, disappointment, shame. And I was, well, not shocked exactly, but I suppose then I was interested in what is the impact of these intense emotional states on the assessment process and on the relationship with the student in particular, and on the relationship with the university. What can it do? And again, I'm not saying it is the case, I'm just saying it could be the case. So in terms of guilt, then, this is a quote from a practice educator not called Daisy, and she's explaining about when she made the decision and telling the student and the guilt there. And she said, I mean, she swore an awful lot, Daisy, but I noticed that when she said, I felt like I'm a rotten shit, it's in the present tense. So even talking about these things is kind of, is kind of bringing up these really difficult feelings. And Claire, first fail, guilty, sleepless nights, that physical feeling sick, felt incredibly guilty. And it's, I suspect, though I don't know, that can lead to anger. And Daisy's going on and on again, it was unbearable. I mean, that's such a powerful phrasing. The guilt, it was unbearable. It was a livelihood, end of her career. Oh my God, what about children? And I suppose I'm used to working with more mature students, I think, or older students. And so, you know, you can understand the sacrifice students have made in terms of the time, the money, the you know, the emotional investment in undertaking a course. So I think some of the guilt kind of turned to anger, really, a defense against anxiety. And Daisy was so angry about this student, even though it happened in the past. I mean, she really let rip in this interview, which was interesting about how, you know, so much anger, but certainly anger. And I was expecting it, really, the practice educator would feel angry towards the student, but actually anger was also about the university. So there was a kind of a relationship breakdown or anger towards the university, not one person in particular, but just the university. We also saw a lot of frustration in the research. So Lily was an interesting character because she was a highly experienced practice educator. She worked with both social workers and nursing students. She worked in a drugs and alcohol agency, and she said she was known that they would send her the difficult ones because she was good at working with them. So this one particular student was essentially homophobic, and she said she worked really hard to try and get him to address this, but ultimately he said something so offensively homophobic that the placement had to end. And I was interested that rather than seeing it as Lily safe social work, you know, from practitioners potentially really homophobic, she saw it as her failing. You know, I must have done something wrong with him. And I saw this in lots of accounts that, you know, people like that, practice educators may internalize the failing as their own. And I think that possibly could, I don't know, make it then hard to fail a student, because actually you think you failed yourself. And I'll be interested to see what people feel about that. And the frustration was a team frustration. So the whole team felt frustrated and helpless. You know, they just couldn't turn it around. So that feeling of being stuck, and, you know, and these are the ripples of when things go wrong on placement, that often the team are impacted. You know, it might set off existing dynamics, or the team just find it awkward and painful. I think if we don't manage these things properly, or acknowledge the kind of the ripples and the after effect, then we risk people never wanting to be a practice educator again. And there's the anxiety again. So Lily, as I spoke about earlier, she worked with another student and she just said, I felt out of my depth. I was really out of my depth. I was completely out of my depth. And she kept repeating that in the interview. And I think that was some projection of the student. I think what she was picking up with the student in this agency with very little experience, feeling completely and utterly out of her depth. So I thought about, and I'm only thinking about, but you know, is there a possible impact? So I'm not saying there is an impact, but is there a possible impact? Could there be a possible impact of these high emotional states? And I said I was surprised in the interview how raw it was for people, even if they'd worked with someone 10 years ago. It was really raw and powerful. And so some of the work I've done myself and Jason Shaw have thought about projective identification. So does that and defenses against anxiety. So there's psychotherapeutic explanations, which I know isn't everyone's cup of tea, but I think they're quite helpful in thinking about what could be going on. So again, I'm not saying that people are failing to fail, but we certainly in my data and Jason Shaw's data, we saw these kind of behaviors. And so one of them, when you're defending against anxiety, i.e. the anxiety of a student failing and you're feeling guilty, is called mobilization, which is you act out the student's projections. And I think I saw that in Lily, where she was saying, I fell out my depth, I'm completely out my depth. And I think it was something about the student's projection that why Daisy was so, you know, angry in this interview. The converse of that is immobilization. So I've also seen this both in my practice and in my data, that the awfulness of it, the guilt, the stress, you know, actually stops practitioners being able to reflect or think or make a decision. So when I talked about the practice educator who bent over backwards, I think that's what happened. She couldn't think, she couldn't reflect on it. So what she did was focus on those really peripheral things, like making sure the student filled out a diary and got places on time. So the defensive behaviours, so, spitting, so university bad, student good, or vice versa, or especially if there's kind of on-site and off-site arrangements. And then what we also saw was very messy, kind of terminated placements. And the problem with those is that the impact on service users and agencies can be quite significant, as well as the student not feeling like they've ended appropriately or properly. And we also saw what we call dramatic endings. So this is students on the whole doing or engaging in behaviours which are very risky to service users or are very unprofessional. And I always say that because I've worked in social education for so long and I've been program leaders, I disproportionately met the very small percentage of students who, really shouldn't be in social work, so I do have stories, but actually 99.9% of students are fine. As we know, it's a very small failure rate. And I think that all of that could lead to not following the assessment procedures. And of course, if you don't follow the assessment procedures, you cannot uphold a fail, and nor would I, because if you say on day 79, the students failed and they haven't had any opportunity to address any of the shortcomings, that's not something we can uphold, and it causes the student immense stress. So I thought about, it could be this is one explanation, but projective identification, which is much more than transference, but it's a whole dumping of very difficult emotions onto the practice educator. And I think what can happen is everyone gets stuck, and tutors can get caught up in that as well. We're stuck, we don't know what to do. So then nothing happens, or something happens that's dramatic and the placement has to end very suddenly. So it's one theory amongst many. So I'm kind of going to a different topic now, but I was reading in a Beddoe and Davis book. It's on professional supervision. I really recommend it. It's really good. And they talked about courageous conversations. So I'd always talked about difficult conversations, but I just like the notion of a courageous conversation, because I think, students, university tutors, practice educators, we all need to have these courageous conversations, because I'm sure they can help when things are not going well in placements. But that, generally conversations associated with some sort of emotion. And, if you're potentially failing the placement, or the practice educator thinks you're failing the placement, obviously emotional states are going to be very high, and they're going to be the ones we talked about earlier: guilt, anger, shame. Okay. And as I said, these are the things they might feel already in advance, and then having those conversations might compound those things. And of course, in social work and other professions, we're talking about values, which are very hard. They're kind of nebulous. What do they look like in practice? Behaviors, what does that mean? But I just like the idea that actually we should all be engaging in courageous conversations, and having those conversations, even though we know they may cause conflict, but they also might resolve issues as well. And I suddenly, I realized a number of years ago what my role was as a university tutor when I go out on placement. It's one, to make sure we all follow the processes to protect students' interests and well-being and rights. But it's also to enable practice educators and students to be able to talk to one another about their feelings, what it's like, what's happening, and what can we do to make things better. And if the student is at risk of failing, then we need to say that very explicitly. And I've been in lots of, placement meetings where there's like a dance, we're all dancing around it, and we're just not saying it as it is. And I think we need to. Of course, we worry that we would hurt people or not hurt people, but we really need to. So I think when things are not going well, and perhaps the student, this isn't about the normal struggles of students, these are things that are not moving, not changing, the students not developing in the way you would expect. I mean, I think the first thing, going back to, you know, what happens when we defend against anxiety, we bury our head in the sand. So going back to that notion, you know, just hope it will go away on its own accord. So I think the first thing is in us and the student as well, but really recognizing and acknowledge that the student is struggling, and those struggles could put the student at risk of failing the placement. So I think really acknowledging it, not making excuses. Oh, well, and I see that kind of practice educators kind of inventing mitigation. Oh, well, they might be behaving like that because, but actually there's no conversation with the student about that. And I think being very clear what the issue is. And again, we have an issue of language here. What do we call a student that's struggling? Is it all right to say struggling? Is it all right to say, are they at risk of failing? If they are failing, you know, that word failing is very, very emotive. So going back to the next bit, really being very clear what it is. Because again, I've been in situations where the practice educators really struggling to articulate what it is. They go, well, you know, she's just annoying people. And it's like, well, you need to say what it is. You know, you can't just say, well, you know. And I think crucially, the bit that can be missing is I mean, I'm talking about tutors as well, is linking it to the assessment framework in place, because I think that helps, doesn't it? You know, when you are doing X, this is the impact, and this is not meeting this requirement. Or, you know, so students may do things or not do things, but being very clear about it, linking it to the assessment framework, because then that will move it from being you and your standards to these standards, recognizing that these standards requirements are difficult. And I think, as I said before, what doesn't happen are these courageous conversations. So making them very explicit to the student, you know, checking back, understanding, you know, has the student only heard the failure bit and they're in a kind of spiral of despair, really. And of course, I think there's always a role for us, practice educators, or us university tutors, to think about what could we do differently? How could we support this student in a different way? How can we do it? But ultimately it's the student's placement, and ultimately it's for them to make the changes required. And I think what I've also seen is the kind of reviewing process isn't there. So students sometimes can make the necessary developments and it's all good. Sometimes with a lot of intervention, students do start to progress, but when that intervention or the focus on them is gone, they kind of slip back. And of course, that's the challenge, isn't it? How much development's enough? You know, what's the start point? What's the end point? Recognizing that development's not linear. So I think there's the courageous conversation. And I think really, I mean, this should be for all teaching and learning relationships. You know, you are if you're a practice educator, tutor, you're in a position of power over that student, and they will feel that very keenly. You've got a weird role, they will feel it very closely. But I think instead of kind of defending against highly emotional states of mind, it's really, I think if you can just reflect and think what it's about, and think what is being communicated here. You know, what is this about? And, you know, trying to help the student with that. As I said, it's not just something you should do for failing students, it's something for all students. So myself and two colleagues, this is an Australian book, we developed this kind of cyclical model, really, which just kind of rephrases what I've just talked about, really. But, you know, thinking about it, acting, recognizing it. There's the courage, conversation and clarity. That's the courageous conversation, and it has to be courageous and it has to be clear. And then there's the planning. What will we provide? What would the student do? And then there's review and reflect. So in social work, we would use action plans if things are going not the way we would like. And I think they're really helpful processes. Ultimately, I feel practice educators are very kind, wonderful people in social work, but can often rescue students and do a little bit too much. So very quickly then, I mean, don't do this, but for those of you that might want to add this to your CPD log with Social Work England or HS, whatever they're called, health, anyway, with your regulatory body, you may want to do this afterwards, and then you could just upload. Just, you know, what have you learned, thought about or reflected on? 3 things you might now do differently. So if you're a student and you want to have a courageous conversation with your practice educator or tutor, what might you do now? And just really think through any, final thoughts or comments. So just to finish off, because then I can see some chats really. I think, when a student is at risk of failing, they're going to feel absolutely dreadful and awful. And I do this exercise where I get people to think about an experience where they failed at in the past. And the feelings are really powerful, despair, shame, apprehension, stuck, feel stupid, worthless, all those things. And I think they're so difficult, and I would argue that they're likely to be projecting them onto you, and you're going to be feeling them. And so it's I guess being able to remain reflective in that very difficult emotional climate. And if you see these feelings as kind of communication rather than attack, but it's hard because whilst I know intellectually what might be going on, it still hurts. And I think it's always going to be painful failing a student. And if it isn't, then probably you shouldn't be in caring professions, because it is sad. It's really sad that for a student, it's horrible to see. And I think just think about the relationship, the university, don't want to get into the blame game because it's really not helpful. And as I said, do address your concerns and, in a timely and explicit fashion with the student. Just keep talking to the student. Don't wait till the tutor get theirs to have a conversation, a bombshell conversation, because I see that as well. And I'm really not having to go at practice educators, because I've also looked at research with tutors and social work tutors, and they're quite critical of their colleagues, social work tutors, other social work tutors, for either not following the process, kind of not supporting the practice educator in the way they feel they ought to. So this is all of us really. Do seek support. It is painful. There is support out there. If you are going through this experience, I can tell you those feelings are normal. Be prepared to have courageous conversations. I'm trying to have them in other parts of my life, really. So I think it's more than being assertive. It's, recognizing these conversations will cause pain, and hopefully the end result will be worth it. And then I realized I've done lots of C's, so courageous conversations, courage, challenges, candor, conversation, and any other C that you would like. So there's some, on the next slide, there's some articles there. So if you're interested in the tutor one, that's Finch 2014. If you can't get hold of these, just email and I'll send them to you. Unless you've got very strong obscenity filters at your work, because some of them have got swearing on. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. If I can stop sharing. Oh yeah, stop share. Okay, so I've missed all the chats. Aisha and Sarah.
Yep. Yeah, so I've just been picking up on the chat there. I've just none at the end with the questions. I suppose there were some earlier points which I can quickly just find.
Yeah, sorry, I know there was an awful lot there and I raced through it. I just could talk about this forever. Sorry.
Hold on. This one, bear with me. It's quite a lot.
I mean, I'm hoping if the students there haven't made you feel too dreadful, because I do recognise that, I've seen placements let students down quite significantly.
So there were comments around from Judith. Lots of support out there for practice supervisors, assessors to help them have those conversations. So there should be no reason for nurses to allow failing students to progress, as we have a duty to preserve the profession, safety. I'm just going to pick up, there's got some new messages now. Oh, just all thank you. It's really interesting rather than me going through all of the chats.
In my initial doctoral research, I interviewed 20, so it's qualitative. It's not, it's qualitative, but there were 5 interviewees who didn't have who were very reflective about the experience. They didn't do the high drama, so they didn't do the Daisy. You know, they were, and I what was different about them? And again, I'm not saying this is the case, but what was different was that they were former mental health social workers, AMPs at the time. So, sorry, people outside the profession. So that means that they had the authority to section people under the Mental Health Act. So I wondered if they were more comfortable making difficult decisions on their own. But that's a PhD for someone. And they acknowledged very explicitly their gatekeeping role. So they said, yes, I'm a gatekeeper for the profession. It's going to happen. Sometimes you'll get a fantastic student. Mostly you'll get a fantastic student, but sometimes you won't. And you need to be prepared to fail them, you know, if you've gone through due process. And they were able to talk about adult learning principles. So they saw a clear differentiation between your work, the student, this is what you're responsible for, this is my responsibilities as a practice educator. And I've also observed in my role as a practice mentor, I've observed new practice educators. And what I noticed is they talked about, we must do this. We must book an appointment with the health visitor. You know, and it was like a blurring of the work when actually, you know, this is the student's work. This is what they need to do. This is their responsibilities. I'm a practice educator. I'm there to offer a framework, but not to spoon feed the student. But I think, you know, it sounds like I'm blaming them, but I think it's really easy to get sucked into these difficult dynamics. So I talked about transactional analysis or theories of transactional analysis. And I know in myself, I'm a terrible rescuer. And I have to watch myself here, you know, that I'm not rescuing people, that I'm allowing them to, you know, have agency and take responsibility.
So we have, thanks, Jo. So we'll just have one question here from Ness. Is there something here about all professions in terms of hierarchy/environment, for example, caseload holders versus less autonomous roles?
I'm not sure I understand the question, sorry. Sorry, Ness. I mean, I don't know is the answer. Ness, could you write a bit more? Right. Yeah, so what I would say that in caseload holders opposed to ward staff, sorry, health visitors. I mean, yeah, so the type of placement, I think, can be a factor in terms of what work you do. If social work students go to local authorities, there's a case system, and actually the practice educator's name will be on that case. So actually, if things go wrong, it could come back to the practice educator. I'm not sure I've answered your question there, sorry. But yeah, confidence to make, and not necessarily difficult decisions, painful ones. And I think in my current role now, you know, one of my roles is examining people's PhDs or doing annual reviews. And it's painful to, it's horrible to say, actually, this doesn't meet the requirements. But I mean, that's part of my professional role, isn't it? I'm a gatekeeper. So Mark, yeah, in many professions. I mean, I wonder about policing, Mark, and how many, actually this would be an interesting study to do in the police force about, you know, new, I don't know what you call them, probationers, and how much guidance and support they get. You know, is it easy? Not easy. You know, is there a concern that police officers are getting into the force that shouldn't be there? And I suspect that every profession will say, oh, these new people coming in, they don't know, they're too weak, too, you know, too millennial, they won't be able to cope with the demands. But, you know, I do want to stress, so Rachel, yeah, sorry, Jo. So there's a couple of articles, and this is an area that does need some research, which looked at the impact on students. There's also work my colleague Prosper Teden that looked at the experience of Black African students. They're basically overfailed. And in terms of successful placements, all I can say is that every practice educator I teach, there will always be one in that class that did fail a placement. So, but it's that, but also that data is quite hard to get hold of. So I did some freedom of information requests to universities. My gut feeling is probably they do pass, but I don't know. And Rachel says, we've seen when practitioners are less confident or new. Yeah. So in my research, there didn't seem to be any difference between if you were a new practice teacher or if you'd done it for 15 years. The experience was still awful, but the new ones would perhaps say, well, I'm very inexperienced, that's probably my fault. So Mark, the new apprenticeship causing these problems? Oh, interesting. But there's a whole load of research there, isn't it? But I do think, you know, what is it, you know, we're in complex professions. So how do we assess what's good enough? And is good enough good enough?
That's all the questions, Jo, with nothing else. I suppose I just want to say at this point then, thank you so much for today's session. It's been really interesting. Have some really great comments. The recording as well for people who want to share will be on YouTube just give us a couple of weeks. But Jo, thank you so much for giving up your time and sharing your knowledge today with us all.
Thank you. I'll talk about it at any time.
Great. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye.